I can't believe you did this to me, I whispered, my voice barely rising above the hum of the conference room's air conditioning. Candace didn't even look up from the polished mahogany table where my proposal, lay under her perfectly manicured hand. The rest of the senior management team sat frozen, waiting for her to respond. This wasn't personal, Amelia, she said coolly. It was just business. You never moved fast enough, and someone had to close the deal. I looked around the room. Just an hour ago, this place was filled with congratulations and clinking glasses as everyone toasted Candace's brilliant strategy. Now, the fluorescent lights felt cold, exposing every crack in the veneer of sisterly support she'd always pretended to offer. A hollow numbness spread through my chest. I'd spent years building this project, believing she respected me, and she'd stolen it without blinking. My name is Amelia Hart, and the first thing anyone ever said about me was that I was the quiet one. I was never the loudest voice in any room, never the most obvious star in any conversation. But I learned early that sometimes the ones who keep their heads down can see everything more clearly. I grew up in the narrow brick house my grandparents bought in 1952, a place where the floors creaked in the winter and the windows stuck shut every August. My parents were the sort who believed in respectability above all else, good grades, clean clothes, and no visible cracks in the facade. From the time I was 5, I knew what it felt like to have to work twice as hard to get half as much recognition. My cousin, Candace, was the golden girl. Even as a child, she sparkled. Straight A's, ballet recitals, student council president. Our families were close in that tight, suffocating way, where every holiday meant polite comparisons and every summer meant weeks of shared space that blurred the lines between affection and competition. I remember one summer afternoon more vividly than most. I must have been about 12. Candace and I were sitting on the back steps of my grandparents' house, eating popsicles that melted faster than we could keep up. She was telling me about how she'd won first place in the science fair again. You should try harder, Amelia, she said, wiping a sticky hand on her shorts. It's not that difficult if you just put in the work. I swallowed the resentment along with the melted cherry syrup pooling at the bottom of the plastic wrapper. I didn't say anything because, in my family, there wasn't room for protest. You accepted your place and learned to make the best of it. But something in me started to burn that day, a quiet determination that I wouldn't always be the one sitting in the background. By the time I was 17, I'd figured out that while Candace craved attention, I craved mastery. I didn't need anyone's praise if I could know for myself that I'd done something exceptional. When I graduated high school, it was with a scholarship that no one expected me to win, least of all Candace. Still, no matter how many small victories I collected, she always seemed to get there first. In college, we both majored in business administration. She chose marketing, I chose operations. She was the face of every group project, flashing her perfect smile in every presentation, while I was the one refining the spreadsheets and fixing the budget forecasts at 3 a.m. After graduation, I spent 3 years building a reputation at Alcott and Mayer Consulting, while Candace floated from position to position, somehow always landing in better roles than she'd earned. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was laying a stronger foundation. And in some ways, it was true. I loved my work. I loved the way an elegant process improvement could save a company thousands, the way a well-designed project plan could turn chaos into order. But it was lonely, too. The late nights in a cubicle lit only by my desk lamp. The sense that no one really saw what I was doing except me. Then, 5 years ago, our paths crossed again. Candace had joined Langford Strategic Solutions, the boutique consulting firm I'd dreamed of working at since grad school. They were known for taking on the biggest, most ambitious projects, mergers, acquisitions, turnarounds. When I interviewed, I knew the competition would be brutal, but I was determined to prove myself. I got the offer, and for the first time, we were colleagues rather than rivals from a distance. At first, it almost felt like we were building something together. She was the firm's brightest client-facing star, and I became the quiet engine behind her success, designing the frameworks, anticipating the risks, building out the systems no one else had the patience to create. I told myself it was a partnership, that her polish and my diligence complemented each other. For a while, that was enough. I think about those early days more often than I admit. The first time I stayed up until dawn in the office, refining a proposal that would eventually become the foundation of the Midtown Consolidation Project, the same project that Candace would later claim as her own. I remember exactly how the floor felt under my aching feet, how the hum of the HVAC system was the only sound in the building, how I looked at my reflection in the darkened window, hair pinned back, blazer rumpled, and thought, this is what I was meant to do. There was something almost holy about that certainty, about the knowledge that I was good at something no one else could see.
Until they did see.
When the proposal landed on the senior partners' desks, the feedback was instant. This was the kind of work that could transform the firm's reputation. I still have the email from Mr. Pierce, the managing partner. Amelia, this is exceptional. I'd like to talk about how you can take on more leadership on this account. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything was changing. But Candace was always one step ahead. Somehow, she was the one who presented the strategy to the client. She was the one whose name was on the executive summary when it went out to the press. And when the bonuses were announced, she was the one applauded for her innovative vision. I remember sitting in the back of the conference room that day, my hands folded in my lap as the applause filled the air. My heart was a stone in my chest. Afterward, when everyone had drifted out, I found her alone by the window. She turned to me with that same polite smile she'd been giving me since we were children. You know, it was just easier this way, she said lightly. They expect me to be the face of these projects. You wouldn't have been comfortable in front of the cameras. That was the moment I understood that to her, my work would always be raw material, something to be reshaped and branded under her name. It wasn't the first time she'd taken something that mattered to me.
But I swore it would be the last.
Still, it took me nearly a year to figure out how to position myself so that I could protect what I'd built. I started documenting everything. Every draft, every edit, every late-night version saved to my personal archive. I built a private dossier of the Midtown Project's evolution, a record that no amount of spin could erase. And in the months that followed, I learned to smile when she took credit for my contributions. I learned to nod and say nothing when she casually dismissed my role in meetings. Because I knew that the day would come when all that careful preparation would pay off. It wasn't just about proving her wrong. It was about proving to myself that I didn't need anyone's validation to know my worth. But the hardest part, the part one didn't tell anyone, was how much it still hurt. Some nights I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our shared childhood. Every time I'd let her take the lead, every time I'd believed her when she said it was easier this way. I'd think about my grandmother, Eleanor Hart, who raised me on stories about quiet strength. She used to say, people will take what you allow them to take. One day, you'll decide you've had enough. That day had finally come, and I was ready. It started quietly, just a short email with the subject line, Project Attribution. I sent it at 6:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, before the building came to life. The early morning had always been my sanctuary. No buzzing phones, no performative greetings, no eyes on me. Just a silent promise that I could still claim the truth for myself. In the body of the email, I attached a timeline of the Midtown Consolidation Project, with every draft, revision, and correspondence, each timestamped, each indisputable. It was the culmination of a year's worth of quiet preparation. The recipients were the 3 senior partners and human resources. I didn't CC Candace. Not yet. When I hit send, my hand didn't even shake. I'd replayed this moment so many times in my mind that it almost felt inevitable. I packed away my laptop, locked the desk, and walked to the window. Sunrise painted the skyline in strokes of pink and gold, the city beginning to stir. For the first time in years, I felt like my life might finally be my own. By 8:05, the emails started coming in, first cautious acknowledgments, then formal requests to meet. But I'd expected that. What I hadn't expected was how quiet Candace would be when she finally confronted me. At 9:15, she walked into my office without knocking. She closed the door carefully, turned the lock with a small click, and stood there for a moment, her back straight, her eyes searching my face for something she didn't find. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice low. "Why now?" I didn't answer her right away. Instead, I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out the thick, navy blue folder I'd prepared. I set it on the blotter between us. "You might want to look through this before we go any further," I said. She stared at it as though it might bite her. Slowly, she sat across from me and flipped it open. Inside were printed copies of everything I'd sent to the partners, my original project notes, email confirmations, the signed development timeline. "This doesn't change anything," she said after a minute, her tone dismissive. But her hand shook just enough that I noticed. "It changes everything," I replied calmly. "You've spent years taking credit for my work. This is where it ends." She let out a brittle laugh. "You really think you'll be the one they believe? You're not built for this kind of confrontation, Amelia. You never have been." There it was again, her favorite weapon. Not outright cruelty, but the soft, pitying tone that always made me feel like a child. But this time, it didn't land. "Funny," I said, "that you're the one who looks nervous." She closed the folder and pushed it back toward me as though it was something unclean. "What is it you want?" she demanded. "An apology? A share of the credit? Because you could have come to me instead of making a scene." "I don't want your apology," I said quietly. "And this isn't a scene. It's a record. One that proves you've violated firm policy and intellectual property agreements." Her jaw tightened. "You're going to ruin everything we've built." I leaned back in my chair, feeling an unfamiliar steadiness settle into my bones. "No," I said. "I'm going to reclaim what I built. You're just going to have to learn to live without it." A muscle twitched in her cheek, but she said nothing. The knock on the door broke the silence. Mr. Pierce's assistant stood there, looking uncomfortable. "Ms. Hart, Mr. Pierce, and Ms. Randall would like to see you both in the main conference room," she said. Candace closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, she was wearing the same professional mask she always did. "Let's go," she murmured. But as we walked side by side down the hallway, I realized she no longer looked certain. Her heels clicked a little too fast across the polished floor, her breathing just a shade too shallow. In that moment, it dawned on me, she'd never believed I had it in me to fight back. And that was her mistake. The meeting was a strange, almost clinical affair. The partners sat in a neat row on one side of the table, HR on the other, and Candace and I in the center. Two opposing forces, tethered by years of shared history and quiet resentment. Mr. Pierce cleared his throat. "We've reviewed the materials Amelia provided this morning," he began, his voice neutral. "It's clear that there are significant discrepancies in how the Midtown Project's authorship has been represented." Candace lifted her chin. If Amelia felt she wasn't recognized, she should have addressed it through the proper channels, not by blindsiding everyone with this narrative. I met her gaze evenly. "I did address it. Repeatedly. You told me it was easier this way." HR slid a printed policy packet across the table toward Candace. "You're aware that misattribution of proprietary work is grounds for disciplinary action, up to and including termination," the woman said gently but firmly. For a moment, the only sound was the muted hum of the HVAC system. "I'd like to take a break," Candace said abruptly. She stood and walked out without waiting for permission. I stayed in my seat. My hands were folded, my breathing steady. 10 minutes later, she came back, her eyes rimmed in red. She avoided looking at me. Mr. Pierce sighed. "Candace, do you have anything you'd like to add?" Her voice was thin. I don't dispute that Amelia contributed significantly, but the client relationship was mine. The firm expected me to lead. It was the closest she'd ever come to admitting the truth. But I wasn't interested in partial confessions. I took a breath. "I'd like to propose a resolution," I said. All eyes turned to me. I laid out my terms calmly. Full formal acknowledgement of my authorship in all records. Transfer of lead project oversight to my name. Immediate elevation to senior project director. A clear statement to the client clarifying the misattribution. Candace shifted in her chair, her expression stunned. "You can't be serious," she whispered. But I was. Mr. Pierce nodded slowly. These are reasonable terms. Candace swallowed, looking like she might be sick. For once, there were no words left to twist, no narratives to spin. She looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. I held her gaze and felt something inside me settle, a quiet finality that was almost peace. When the meeting ended, I didn't wait for her to follow me. I stepped into the hallway alone, the folder still in my hand. In that moment, I realized the power I'd always given her was mine to revoke. And I had. I thought the meeting would be the end of it. It wasn't. The fallout started that same afternoon, the moment I stepped back into my office. My phone was already buzzing with messages, some congratulatory, some guarded, some downright hostile. The first call came from Andrew in marketing, whose voice was thick with a kind of hesitant camaraderie. "Hey, Amelia, just wanted to say, well, I'm glad you finally got the credit. A lot of us saw what was happening, you know." I almost laughed. If they'd all seen, why hadn't any of them said a word? But I thanked him anyway, because I knew he meant well. The next call was from Lisa, one of the senior analysts. Her voice was shaking. "I can't believe you did it," she whispered. "I wish I'd had the guts to do something like that." "You still can," I told her. "You don't have to stay quiet." She didn't answer, but something in her breathing made me think maybe she'd finally started to believe it. By the time Candace reappeared in my doorway, her expression was no longer shocked. It was controlled, so controlled it was almost eerie. "Congratulations," she said flatly. "I suppose you've been rehearsing that speech for years." I looked up from my laptop. I didn't rehearse anything. I just told the truth. Her lips twisted into a brittle smile. "You think this is over, Amelia? You've humiliated me in front of the entire firm. You've made me look incompetent." I closed my computer gently. "I didn't make you look incompetent. You did that yourself." For a moment, her face flickered with something raw, fury, maybe, or panic. But she smoothed it away almost instantly. "You've always been ungrateful," she said quietly. "You have no idea how much I did for you." There it was again. The gaslighting, the rewriting of reality, so she could cast herself as the benevolent protector. "You didn't do it for me," I replied. "You did it because you liked having control. And you're angry because you don't have it anymore." She stepped further into my office, lowering her voice. "You think the partners will keep supporting you? You think clients won't start asking questions about whether you're difficult to work with?" I didn't flinch. "Let them ask. I have the record to prove my work." For the first time, she didn't have an answer. She turned and walked out, her heels striking the tile like gunshots. It didn't take long for the rest of the firm to start choosing sides. Some people avoided me altogether, their eyes sliding away whenever I passed in the hallway. Others stopped by my office to offer cautious support, just enough to feel righteous, but not enough to risk their own reputations. But a handful surprised me. Lisa, for one. She showed up after hours one evening with a cardboard box in her arms, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. "I'm leaving," she said simply. "I've been waiting for an excuse, and this was it." I looked at the box, half full of framed photos and files. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Candace made me feel like I was worthless for 3 years. Watching you stand up to her, I don't know, it just made me realize I can't keep letting people treat me like I'm invisible." I felt a swell of something I hadn't expected. Pride. "Where are you going?" I asked. "I have some savings," she said. "And a few freelance contracts lined up. I'll figure the rest out." I smiled. "Good for you." Before she left, she paused in the doorway. "You know she's not done, right?" "I know," I said. Candace's next move came the following week. It was a glossy press release she sent to several industry publications, announcing her decision to transition into an advisory role to support new leadership. The language was polite, gracious, carefully designed to protect her reputation. But anyone who'd been paying attention knew the truth. She was stepping back because she had no other option. She tried to spin it as though she was magnanimous, above the petty drama. But it didn't matter. The partners had already made their decision. The Midtown consolidation project was mine. Still, the whispers continued. In meetings, some of the junior associates avoided eye contact. A few asked carefully phrased questions. Was I planning to reorganize the teams? Would Candace still have a say in strategic planning? Each time, I gave them the same calm answer. I'm here to do my job, and I expect all of you to do yours. But behind closed doors, I was exhausted. I'd spent so long preparing for the confrontation that I hadn't thought about what came next, the quiet fallout, the strained alliances, the creeping doubt. Was I becoming the kind of person I'd sworn I'd never be? One night, after another 12-hour day, I sat alone in my office and thought about my grandmother. I could still hear her voice. One day, you'll decide you've had enough. She hadn't told me that deciding wasn't the same as feeling triumphant. The next day, I walked into the main conference room for a quarterly planning session. Candace was there, sitting at the far end of the table. Her eyes met mine, cool and inscrutable. I took my seat and began the presentation without acknowledging her presence. Halfway through, she interrupted. I'd like to clarify that the client relationship remains under my management, she said crisply. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. With respect, I said, the client has already confirmed in writing that they prefer to coordinate with me going forward. The room went still. Candace's jaw tightened. We'll see how long that lasts. After the meeting, she cornered me in the hallway. You think you've won, she said, her voice low and trembling. I studied her face, the careful makeup, the professional mask that was starting to crack. I don't think I've won, I said. I think I've finally stopped losing. She looked at me for a long moment, her mouth working around words she couldn't quite form. Then she turned and walked away. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected began to happen. People started coming to me, not just with questions but with trust. Junior analysts asked for my input. Clients requested me by name. Even a few senior partners stopped by my office to offer quiet encouragement. And gradually, the constant thrum of anxiety began to fade. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't sitting in the background, hoping someone would notice. I was here. I was seen. And no one could take that away again. By the time summer settled over the city, the air was heavy with a kind of exhausted peace. Candace had officially stepped down from her leadership role, her advisory capacity reduced to a polite fiction. The partners framed it as a natural transition, but everyone understood the reality. At first, I thought I'd feel triumphant, but what I felt was something quieter, something closer to relief. It wasn't that I didn't want her held accountable. I did. But I'd learned the hard way that accountability doesn't always look like public disgrace. Sometimes, it's just the moment you realize you've lost the right to be trusted. She had lost that, and I had gained something I hadn't expected: clarity. 3 weeks after Candace left the Midtown project entirely in my hands, I scheduled a meeting with Mr. Pierce. We sat across from each other in his office, the late afternoon light catching on the rows of awards lining the shelves. I want to talk about next steps, I began. My voice didn't tremble. He smiled just slightly. You've earned the right to set the agenda. I took a breath. I'd like to propose a restructuring of the team. I've seen firsthand how easy it is for contributions to be overshadowed or misattributed. If we want to retain good people, we need to change how we recognize their work. His expression grew thoughtful. You're suggesting formal documentation of authorship on every project?
Yes.
And clear protocols for attribution in client presentations. He nodded. I think that's overdue. We talked for another hour about policy drafts, training sessions, ways to rebuild a culture of integrity. As I left his office, I realized this was the part I'd never imagined, that the real power wasn't in proving Candace wrong. It was in using what I'd learned to make things better for everyone else. The following week, I called a meeting with the entire project team. Some of them looked nervous as they filed in, no doubt expecting another round of fallout. But when I stood at the head of the table, I felt none of the old dread. I know the last few months have been difficult, I began. I won't pretend otherwise. But I want you all to know that things will be different going forward. I outlined the new policies: shared credit, transparent documentation, open lines of communication. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Lisa, who had decided to stay after all, raised her hand.
"Thank you," she said simply.
For making space for the rest of us. I felt something warm bloom in my chest. This team deserves it, I replied. Later that evening, I stayed behind to tidy up the conference room. As I gathered the leftover printouts, I noticed a small envelope someone had left behind. Inside was a folded note.
"I'm sorry."
There was no signature, but I didn't need one. For a long moment, I just stood there, the paper soft between my fingers. Maybe this was the closest Candace would ever come to an apology. And maybe that was enough. The next morning, I arrived early to prepare for a client presentation. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sun rise over the city. The streets below glimmered with possibility. I thought about how many nights I'd spent in this building, feeling invisible. How many times I'd convinced myself that invisibility was the price of being good at what I did. But I wasn't invisible anymore. And I wasn't angry, not really. Not the way I had been. I understood now that Candace had taken from me because she believed I would never stop her. And for a long time, she'd been right. But the moment I'd chosen to speak up, everything had shifted. Not just for me, but for everyone watching. That afternoon, Lisa stopped by my office. She looked lighter than I'd ever seen her. "I wanted to thank you again," she said. "Not just for the policies. For proving we don't have to let people walk all over us." I smiled. "You did that yourself." She hesitated in the doorway. "Have you talked to Candace?" "Not since she left the project," I said. "She's different now," Lisa said quietly. "I think she's starting to understand what she lost." I thought about the note in my drawer. "Maybe," I said. That evening, as I locked up my office, I realized I wasn't carrying the same weight anymore. I had reclaimed my work, my voice, and something deeper, my faith in myself. And while I knew Candace's absence left a void in the firm, it didn't feel like a loss to me. It felt like a necessary clearing. The next day, I got a call from an old professor who'd followed my career from afar. "I read about the Midtown project," he said. "I'm proud of you." I smiled. "Thank you. It was a long time coming." "You know," he continued, "sometimes the hardest part isn't standing up to someone else. It's standing up to the version of yourself who believed you couldn't." I sat back in my chair, letting the truth of that settle into my bones. He was right. By early autumn, the Midtown project had entered its final phase. The client was thrilled, the partners were satisfied, and the team had found a new rhythm. One afternoon, as I was reviewing a budget forecast, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to pick up. "Hello." There was a pause. "It's Candace." I didn't say anything. "I just wanted you to know I'm leaving Langford entirely," she said finally. "I'm starting over." I closed my eyes. "Good luck," I said softly. Another pause. "For what it's worth, you were always better at this than me." The line clicked dead before I could reply. I set the phone down. For a long moment, I just sat there, breathing. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was release. That evening, I walked home instead of taking a cab. The air was crisp, the sidewalks scattered with fallen leaves. I thought about everything I'd lost, and everything I'd found in its place. I'd thought this journey was about proving Candace wrong. But it wasn't. It was about proving to myself that I didn't have to accept the story I'd been handed. I could write a new one. And I had. 3 months later, I barely recognized the person I used to be. The firm had changed in ways I hadn't dared hope for. The new project attribution policies were already making a difference. Junior staff were more willing to share ideas, and no one was afraid to speak up in meetings anymore. One Friday morning, I was finalizing a report when Lisa knocked on my door. "We're taking you out to lunch," she announced. "No excuses." I laughed. "I have 3 calls after this." "They can wait," she insisted, grinning. So I let them wait. We ended up at a small cafe with mismatched chairs and watercolor paintings on the walls. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was just another face in the crowd. I was the leader they trusted. Over salads and coffee, Lisa leaned across the table. "Did you ever think you'd be here?" she asked. I looked around at my team, their laughter mingling with the clatter of silverware. No, I admitted. But I'm glad I am. That evening, I walked back to the office alone. The sun was sinking behind the skyscrapers, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. I paused outside the building, remembering all the nights I'd stood here feeling too small to matter. But I wasn't small anymore. And I did matter. A week later, I attended my first client pitch as senior project director. It was for a high-profile merger that could secure the firm's reputation for the next decade. As I stood at the head of the polished conference table, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass wall, shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes steady. I'd thought this moment would feel like revenge. Instead, it felt like coming home to myself. The clients signed the contract that afternoon. When the last handshake was over, Mr. Pierce pulled me aside. "You've done something remarkable," he said quietly. "Not just for the firm, but for the people here." I smiled. "Thank you." He studied me for a moment, then added, "Candace called me last week." I held my breath. "She asked me to tell you she's moved out of the city," he continued. "She's taking some time to figure out what comes next." I nodded. "I hope she finds what she's looking for," I said.
And I meant it.
That weekend, I finally did something I'd been putting off. I drove to the old brick house where my grandmother had raised me. The new owners had repainted the shutters, planted bright flowers along the porch. I stood at the gate for a long time, remembering her voice. "One day, you'll decide you've had enough." I closed my eyes, feeling the truth of it all over again. And then I turned away, ready to begin the rest of my life. Back in my apartment, I pulled out the envelope Candace had left in the conference room, the one with the simple "I'm sorry" scrawled inside. For a long time, I'd imagined that an apology from her would erase everything that had happened. But it hadn't.
And that was okay.
Some wounds didn't need to be forgotten. They needed to be honored. 3 months later, the firm held a celebration in my honor, marking the successful completion of the Midtown Consolidation Project. I almost didn't go, but Lisa talked me into it, promising it would be small, informal, nothing like the glossy ceremonies Candace had loved. When I arrived, the conference room was strung with soft lights and fresh flowers. There were no speeches, no forced applause. Just my colleagues, smiling, lifting glasses to toast what we'd accomplished together. I stood near the window, watching the city lights bloom in the dusk. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt whole. Later that night, as the last guests trickled out, Lisa handed me a small wrapped box. "What's this?" I asked. "Open it," she urged. Inside was a delicate silver pendant engraved with a single word, "Enough." I looked up, throat tight. "You reminded all of us," she said softly, "that we don't have to keep giving pieces of ourselves away." I closed my hand around the pendant. "Thank you," I whispered. The next morning, I woke early and went to my favorite cafe. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, the pendant resting warm against my skin. Outside, the city moved around me, buses rumbling by, pedestrians hurrying past. I used to feel like I was on the outside looking in, but not anymore. 3 weeks later, I hosted a small gathering at my apartment. Lisa came, along with Andrew and several others who had quietly supported me. We ate takeout on mismatched plates and laughed until it hurt. At one point, I stepped into the kitchen to refill drinks. I paused, taking in the scene, the cluttered counters, the warm glow of lamplight, the easy camaraderie. This was what I'd been working toward all along. Not just recognition.
Connection.
Belonging. Near the end of the evening, Lisa pulled me aside. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. I thought about it every sleepless night, every moment I doubted myself, every bruise Candace had left on my confidence. "No," I said finally. "I don't. Because without all of it, I wouldn't have become the woman I was now." Months passed, and the seasons turned. The Midtown Consolidation Project became the gold standard for the firm's operations. New clients came in waves, drawn by the promise of integrity and excellence. I was offered a partnership track, something I'd once thought was reserved for people like Candace. But now I knew better. It wasn't about who spoke the loudest. It was about who did the work and refused to be erased. One evening, I stayed late at the office to finish a proposal. I took a moment to walk through the empty halls, remembering all the times I'd tiptoed here, afraid of being seen. Now, the quiet felt different. It felt like possibility. I stopped at the window, looking out over the city. And I thought about my grandmother again. One day, you'll decide you've had enough. That day had changed everything. And as I stood there, the lights glowing like stars, I knew something even more important. It wasn't just that I'd had enough. It was that I'd finally become enough.